to Hope Family Resources, where counseling resources bring hope to the heart of your family. In today's program, Dr. Denise Mari and Tom Lamar discuss the different types of abuse and their root causes and offer some remedies and tools for easing the pain of abuse.
Dr. Mari, how do you define abuse?
Abuse actually refers to treatment of another person which is cruel and dehumanizing, which really amounts to a lack of love, a lack of loving kindness. And I think the key word is dehumanizing. At some level, abuse really can be said to be psychologically disfiguring of another person.
Will you talk about the different types of abuse?
Yes, actually, I think it would be good to cover verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and even spiritual abuse. These are the four most important types of abuse to address today.
Let's focus on verbal abuse. How do you define that?
Well, verbal abuse really is referring to the use of speech and language in a way that does not respect the other person. So the abuse of language would be perhaps mean, cruel words that are spoken from one person to another.
How common is abuse, verbal abuse in our families?
Well, unfortunately, verbal abuse is all too common today in our households. Unfortunately, people tend to not really give so much care or concern to what is coming out of their mouths. In fact, I think a lot of the problem is that what's in their hearts is not that loving, and it tends to slip through in the words that are used to address another person.
Is abuse, verbal abuse, yelling at children?
Okay, well, when we're talking about yelling, we have to be careful because, for example, if a child is crossing the street and he finds that a car is coming directly at him and his mother comes out of the house and yells at him, certainly yelling would be meant to save his life, and that's certainly not abuse. So if we're talking about, however, the kind of verbal abuse, which is yelling, then we're talking about using words in a way that is too loud, let's say for the ears, or hurting the heart of perhaps a child. A child's heart is very soft, and it's something that has a psychologically hurtful impact.
Dr. Mari, what would be signs that a person has been verbally abused?
Okay, when we're talking about verbal abuse, I think we can look at an increase in fear in the receiver of the abuse. A person who is receiving verbal onslaughts regularly can become rather bitter at the treatment, perhaps will start to feel that he's walking on eggshells around the abusive person. Perhaps also you'll find that the victim of verbal abuse begins to somewhat withdraw or isolate himself from other people. So it can begin a pattern which is somewhat avoidant in order to avoid being inflicted with pain or injury.
Let's move on to physical abuse. How do you define that?
Well, physical abuse now is something beyond just verbal abuse. Verbal, we're talking about use of words. Now we're talking about using our God-given bodies to inflict injury and pain on other people. And when we're talking about physical abuse, we're talking about violence. We're talking about the use of body parts to inflict pain or injury on another person, or perhaps even at some level attaching weapons to parts of our body to actually harm another individual. So this is certainly not the way that God intended for our bodies to be used.
What about the frequency of physical abuse?
Well, physical abuse certainly has been on the rise from the 60s to the 70s, and then even more significantly from the 70s to 80s, and then of course into the 90s. So it's unfortunately all too common today.
Is spanking a child a form of physical abuse?
Okay, when we're talking about a child who has been given repeated fair warning from a parent not to engage in certain behaviors that are ugly or false or bad, and the child then receives a proper spanking for disobeying a parental command, we're not talking about abuse here. We're talking about abuse when a child, for example, is forgetful or absent-minded, or perhaps ignorant about a particular rule, and a parent perhaps spanks too intensely or inappropriately, causing the child pain, but it's not called for in the particular situation. So that's really critical to look at the difference. And we also have to remember too that although spanking may be called for in a particular incident, a particular instance may at the same time become abusive if, for example, a parent drops the clothes of a child from the waist down, adding a sexually humiliating element to it. And then we have to be very careful about what we're talking about. I think that's where the line of abuse is crossed over.
Besides the obvious physical abuse signs such as cuts and bruises, what would be some of the more subtle signs of abuse?
Okay, if we're talking about physical violence, then we're really moving beyond verbal abuse to something that can cause more serious symptoms. So a person has been physically abused, may be developing panic attacks, phobias, for example, like agoraphobia, fear of going outside. There could be a fear that's excessive about being touched, so a person may be afraid even of being lovingly touched by another person. A physical abuse victim could also start to experience obsessions, perhaps, thoughts that are repeating, in other words, and also depression. So it gets to be pretty serious as you're moving on to more chronic physical violence.
Dr. Mari, is there a difference between physical abuse and neglect?
Okay, physical abuse and neglect can actually share in the symptoms that they produce in the victim. However, you can differentiate them in the sense that physical abuse is more of an active form of harming another person, while neglect, on the other hand, is more of a passive form of harming someone. So let's say abuse would be punching another person unnecessarily, perhaps an unprovoked punching. But physical neglect would be, for example, let's say the mother who neglects to feed her child or bathe her child on a fairly regular basis, let's say in a week's time. And it could even be emotional neglect if, let's say there's an infant and a mother doesn't engage in regular daily hours of kind of lovey-dovey baby talk. That is a form of emotional neglect. And actually, you might even say there's spiritual neglect. For example, the family that doesn't introduce their child to God at an early age, that would be a form of spiritual neglecting.